would it be okay for us to do the housekeeping and then roll call?
Yes, sorry, I just got the notice about recording. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so welcome everybody to today's Legal Service Trust Fund Commission Rules Committee meeting. I'm going to hand it over to Kim, Kimberly Wormsley in our office to do some housekeeping announcements.
Okay, excuse me. Welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Rules Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We will begin shortly. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to make a comment during the meeting, please type "I have a comment" or "I have a question" in the chat, and a message will be sent to the host. Alternatively, you can also use the raise hand feature. In an effort for transparency for all those joining this public meeting, whether by phone or Zoom, we request that you refrain from having any side conversations on the chat about the content of the meeting. Again, the chat feature is utilized simply as a tool for you to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. Moving forward, this meeting and all Legal Services Trust Fund Commission meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar's website. As a friendly reminder, those of you with a, excuse me, as a friendly reminder, this is a video conference meeting, and please be aware of the surroundings behind you. For those using Zoom on the computer, when on mute, holding down the space bar will temporarily unmute. If you are on your phone to dial into the meeting, please be sure that your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback issues. While joining audio via the computer is highly recommended. If individual loses audio, they can join separately using the Zoom call-in number. Thank you. Dawn, I think some more people have to promote, so could you hold on before you start doing roll call?
Sure.
Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dewan Wing. I'm the staff coordinator for this committee, and the chair is Amin Al-Sarraf. And Amin, if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and take roll call.
Yes, that sounds good. Thanks, Dawn.
Amin Al-Sarraf.
Here.
Luis Bayless, Fightmaster.
Here.
Catherine Blakemore. Catherine Blakemore. I believe she's coming, but coming a little bit late. Erica Connolly.
She's here. She just.
Oh, she's here. Oh, okay, she is here. Maybe I
She needs to be promoted.
Okay, great. Hi, Catherine.
Good afternoon.
Erica Connolly.
Here.
Corey Friedman.
Here.
Jim Meeker.
Here.
Judge Settleman. Judge Settleman, I thought I saw. There, okay, great.
You got it.
Okay, great. Amin, we have quorum. Would you like me to take roll call for liaisons and staff?
Yes, that sounds good. Thanks, Dawn.
Christine Gonang. Mark Tony. Selena Copeland.
Present.
Great. State Bar staff. Elizabeth Hom.
Here.
Brady Dewar.
Here.
Crystal Bonding.
Here.
And I also want to introduce everybody. We have a new staff member, new senior program analyst that started with us this week, Danielle McCrae. This is her first week, and so you'll see more of her. She'll be attending and helping out with both the grants administration as well as the diversity inclusion work. And Bonnie, are you there, Bonnie? For liaison, Bonnie Huff?
She typed in the chat that she's here.
Okay, great.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Bonnie. Are there any members of the public who would like to introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Lauren Klein from LAC. I'm also here.
Okay, hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Okay.
This is also Zach Newman from Black. Hi,
Hi,
everybody.
Zach. Anybody else who would like to introduce yourself? Or staff that I missed? Okay, Amin, I'll hand it back over to you to do public comments.
Okay, thanks, Dawn, and welcome everybody. Welcome to Danielle, and welcome to everybody else who's joined the meeting. Let's start off with public comment. Does anybody have public comment to share?
Kim, I don't see any raised hands. Do you?
I don't either.
I don't see anything in the chat box.
No.
I believe no public comments at this point.
Okay, all right, then let's roll into our first or the next agenda item, which is the minutes from the last meeting. I apologize, I was not able to attend the last meeting, but I read through the minutes. I'm going to abstain from commenting or voting on it, but if anybody else has any comments on it, please say so now.
I'll move to adopt the minutes.
Thank you, Corey.
I'll second.
I'm sorry, who was that second? Erica?
Erica.
And Amin, would you like me to take roll call?
Yes, thank you.
Amin?
I abstain.
Luis? Luis, did you want to vote?
She may be away from her desk at the moment.
She stepped away from her computer.
Okay. Catherine?
Yes, approve.
Thank you. Erica Connolly?
Yes.
Corey?
Yes, and sorry if there's background Muppets.
No problem. Jim?
Yes.
We have 4, so motion passes.
Okay, and by the way, thank you, Erica, for chairing that meeting. I appreciate that.
No problems.
So the next agenda item is it's the lone agenda item for this meeting, but it's a significant discussion substantively. And I think I'll turn it over to Crystal and Duan to sort of set the stage for the discussion, and I know Crystal has a presentation to provide him. There's a lot to be discussed, so I'll turn it over now.
Okay. So Crystal will be presenting today on behalf of her working group. Crystal, did you have the slides or did you want me to pull it up?
I have the slides.
Okay.
I'll share my screen. Just because of the visibility, if there's any comments or questions, I think Duan, Elizabeth, if you can just let me know. There may be some questions along the way. All right. Okay, great. Can everyone see this okay?
It's half screen.
Half
At least that's how I see it.
Okay.
Me too.
I only see half the screen as well.
Oh, okay. This is a weird technical. Okay, share one more time. Okay,
Yes,
is it a
that's
full screen
better.
now?
Oh yeah, that's better.
Full screen. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Crystal Bending. I'm a senior program analyst with the Office of Access and Inclusion. The purpose of our discussion today is regarding the codification issue of competitive discretionary grants. Just to note, the working group for this particular issue is Amin, Jim, and then we also have Christina Vanarelli, who is not part of the Rules Committee, but she is the chair of the Partnership Grants Committee because it is one of our main discretionary grants. We thought that her input would be valuable in gathering for the working group and their preliminary recommendations. So here's kind of the agenda that I have scheduled set for today. First, I kind of go over all of the competitive discretionary grants by providing an overview. We're going to be looking at 4 different types of grants and in various data points, just so everyone can get some bearings in terms of how the grants are similar and how they're different. So those will be in accordance with governing authorities and the purpose, eligibility requirements across all of the grants, the award information, scoring rubric categories, as well as any allocated points, and some informational slides about the application review process. Afterward, I have a couple of discussion questions that we wanted to kick off during today's preview, which is the purpose of our get together today. In terms of our current competitive discretionary grants, there are 4 types: the bank settlement, homelessness prevention, EF partnership grant, and our provisionally licensed lawyer. Just laying it out there, and you'll see why they're color coded in the next slide. So the first data point that I wanted to share across all of the 4 competitive discretionary grants was the governing authorities and the purpose. So the first row here has kind of the origination of their grant and when it first started. The second row are the governing authorities for each of the respective grants as listed in the request for proposal or the RFPs. The third row is just a brief description of the purpose of each of the grants. I believe all of you are pretty much aware of these main grants. And then the fourth last row on the bottom are just any committees assigned or tasked with making funding recommendations and reviewing the proposals, etc. So pausing here to see if there's any questions, or I can move on. Great.
I have one quick question for the this is Selena, for HP grants. Are all the HPs under 12,531? Because we will be on our 3rd HP grant, so I don't know if they're all the same. I can't remember.
Crystal, would you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Okay. No, they're not all under 12,531. That's just for the first year, and then we got another distribution last year, and I can't remember off right now the code section, but they're not yet.
Thank you for calling that out. I'll note that in our main memo as well, just to note the distinctions. Great, so just moving on in terms of eligibility requirements, these were pulled again from those requests for proposals, outlined in terms of who the funding opportunity is available to, whether that's QLSPs and support centers. Partnership is different in here, where it's eligible or it's available to qualified legal services providers, and any other specific eligibility requirements as listed. So this is just an overview. All right, and then just for reference, I did include the State Bar funding history from 2007 until 2021, just to get a sense in terms of the total pie of funding that we do distribute in terms of formulas and the discretionary grants. Notably the IELTS and EAF distribution amounts are larger. And then, just to note, I believe the EAF that HP figure does aggregate the formula and the discretionary award amount as well. So the total amount for the discretionary grants is a smaller pie than in comparison to the larger funding that we administer. All right, so the next data point across the 4 grants is the award information, and this is just noting, the different award amounts for various grant years. I went back a few years for a couple of them just to get a sense of the scope. Partnership grant, since it originated in the 90s, I pulled the most recent award amount from 2021. Also the different grant periods, which does vary from 1-year grant period. PLL has a 17-month award, and then the bank grants did span from 1 to 3 year for the grant periods. Also listed here are the number of projects that were awarded these grants throughout the number of years, varying again. If you're thinking about in comparison to the IELTS, which typically has about 100 or so grantees, the number of projects applying for these funding opportunities are slightly smaller. And then Just the last row there for reference was, one-time funding in terms of when the money should be used. Partnership notably is ongoing funding. Pausing here again to see if there's any questions so far. Okay, great. So getting into scoring rubric categories, we just also wanted to list this all out just so everyone can take a look in terms of comparing them across each other. I did want to note for HP, partnership, and PLL, these were all formal scoring rubrics that were listed in the request for proposals, meaning there were like a rubric structure with points allocated, showing what the committee was going to be considering during the review of the submitted proposals. Bank grant did have categories, but they weren't, they were used more of an informal tool. During the committee and staff review, I think they had implemented an informal way to assign 1 through 5 points for all of the 9 categories, resulting in 20 and 45 points. But again, that was an unpublished scoring. But the HP partnership grant and PLL scores were all published in the subsequent meeting materials. Just to note here, there's a little asterisk. Why there's so many colors is that in looking at the different RFPs and the description of these categories, staff also color coded any kind of similarly sounding or similarly similar categories with intents, just to kind of see what it looks like so far, and are there similarities across the grants. So for example, organizational excellence and bank grant sounded very similar to organizational capacity in HP, as well as administration on the partnership grant. And we just wanted to try and draw some lines of parity if during this preliminary stage. All right, and then this is more of like a reference point in terms of the reporting requirements. We just wanted to have a sense of after being awarded their grant, what grantees would be required to report. And as you can see, some of the grants are a little bit more intensive and more fiscally focused than some of the other reporting requirements. All right, so application review timeline. As everyone knows who's served on a committee reviewing these discretionary grants, they do vary. So the 2 main dates that I pulled were the start date, which is when the RFP is due and submitted on Smart Simple, and then kind of capping it at the committee's review and approval before it goes to the commission, or in partnership grants case, the judicial council, just to get a sense of what those dates look like. So they do vary across the 4. And I have another graphic, just a warning, it's visually a lot, but I think hopefully will be a little bit helpful to understand. So this slide here has each of the 4 grants, a couple of the timelines, and color coded by processes that were either led by staff, or the committee was primarily involved in that process. So blue is the committee and orange is the staff. And as you can see across the 4 grants, we've had a variety in terms of the mix and the combination of who would be primarily responsible for reviewing the applications and making funding recommendations. Just wanted to call out the HP grants had a bit of an integrated approach in terms of staff reviewing, the committee reviewing a subset, staff reviewing all of the applications, and then the committee making the funding recommendations. Partnership grant, which were this is specifically to the 2022 scoring rubric that was recently approved. This is kind of how the application process looks like. As you can see, it's a lot of it's integrated as well, and seeing the initial calibration, that's what staff started off with. Committee did the same thing. Staff looked at all the proposals. The committee looked at a subset of proposals, had some calibration sessions, and then ultimately staff had some tentative funding recommendations for the committee to consider and adjust. PLL was the most recent round of discretionary grants, which staff had done the initial calibration through the funding recommendation process. So this is a lot, so I wanted to pause here to see if there's any questions or anything that didn't make sense. Duana, is it your hand raised?
Oh, yeah, it is. I just wanted to add something just to point out the contrast between the first round of bank grants and the PLL grants. So in 2015, that was the first time the office received a large amount of discretionary grants. And when we did for the bank grant, the development of that RFP, the committee, because it was kind of one of our first forays into large discretionary grants, decided to review the entire set of application. And so that was I believe at that time 50 or 60 applications, and every community member reviewed the entire 50 or 60, and it seemed like it was a heavy lift, and so that's why we've not modified that approach from other iterations of bank grants.
I just have a quick question. I recall that in some of these there was also an initial stage of encouraging programs to come up with projects, right? A sort of outreach stage, and just for the benefit of the committee members, maybe you could just let people know which ones those were and how that was done too.
Crystal, would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, I know the outreach in terms of partnership grants, but not necessarily the other ones. So just for partnership grants, after the application was made available in January, we did have a webinar to lay out the new scoring rubric, go over the request for proposal and those requirements, eligibility requirements, et cetera, which garnered some additional interest in submitting projects. But Juan, if you could speak as to the other ones.
Yeah, with bank grants, I mean, we had a couple iterations of them. There was one RFP where, because it was a large amount of money that we were distributing, the commission at the committee's recommendation decided to provide $10,000 planning grants. They were year-long grants so that programs could take the whole year to kind of plan to see if there are viable partnerships and collaborations in the community. And then in other instances, like with the homelessness prevention, we held statewide coordination meetings, invited speakers to come. We also did this for the big grant, had a big convening and invited speakers to come talk about kind of trends in service delivery, had breakout sessions. And we did that with big grants in person. With HP, it was all virtual. Following the big HP convening, we did have regional breakout sessions so that people had an opportunity to brainstorm at that regional level. And I would encourage if we move towards distributing large amounts of funding like that has been really helpful to grantees to have a place to brainstorm with one another and with staff. But they've all been handled a little bit differently. Corey, that helps.
Great. All right, I'll move on here. So in terms of the application review process, I did give a brief kind of description of what that looked like in terms of the different competitive discretionary grants. I now have a couple of examples just for additional reference. This first one is the IOLTA and EF application review process, which is a formula-based grant. Just a quick recap, staff reviews the applications to confirm eligibility and accuracy. Any eligibility issues are elevated to the eligibility and budget review committee meeting. This is about 3 to 4 meetings. And any complex issues are then elevated to further eligibility review conference. The committee then makes a final recommendation to the Trust Fund Commission. And this is where the variance is significant variance is that the grant awards are determined by formula versus the discretionary grants, which are determined by the respective committees. Another review process that I also included here was the Legal Services Corporation, who does have several discretionary grants, and this is just pulled from their website for their transformation grant, I believe, and an overview of this process. Again, eligibility review is conducted by staff. There's an expert in programmatic review, which looks like a combination of both staff and hired experts. Sometimes I guess in this specific grant, there is an interview with the executive director. And then quality control and risk assessment that's conducted by staff, and subsequently they make the staff recommendations, and the LSC president makes a final decision for funding. So this is just an additional data point for comparing, what other agencies and organizations do. They'll find a third one that I also included in today's deck is kind of what the application and selection process looks like for a foundation. This is for the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, and it's very different, as you can just see here. First off, the proposals are sent by invitation only, and interested organizations have to actually request to apply. And if they do apply, proposals are submitted to the foundation's program director. Program staff conducts extensive review of the application, and which may entail visits, follow-up meetings with the applicant staff, reference checks, and some other program and financial assessments. Third step is that the program staff presents funding recommendations to the foundation's board of trustees for final approval. So that was a recap of all of the competitive grants. It's competitive grants in 15 minutes. So these are the discussion questions that we wanted to kind of have a discussion about today with the group. Before I get into that, I think I see Jim's hand is raised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you look at any of the other commissions out there? Because there are 52 of them. Each state has one, plus I think Puerto Rico and DC, and they do varying level of grant dispersals. And I was just wondering, some of the larger ones, like in New York and stuff, if you looked at how they handle discretionary grants.
I didn't pull that data point, but I can have that prepared. When the working group gets together. I think from our earlier discussion, we were talking about the foundations and LSCs particularly. I might have missed that in my follow up, but we can get that as well.
And the experts that LSC relies on, how are those determined?
So I know in the working group meeting, I mentioned we would reach out to LSC. So I just heard back from them yesterday. So we're scheduling a call with them. And so we can get that information for the working group.
Great.
So I'm trying to think if whether we should, I'll mention all three questions, and as they kind of come up or thoughts come, or initial thoughts come to them, anyone's welcome to give their input. So the three kind of discussion questions we had, given all of the information we know of their discretionary grants, is, one, should a standard scoring rubric approach be utilized for all future competitive discretionary grants? The second is, should overlapping categories and scoring allocations be streamlined? And the third is, should the committees focus on substantive and policy-related issues during application review? So in looking at the first question, it's not necessarily, just to clarify, it's not the same scoring rubric. It's more so utilizing a scoring rubric approach for all future competitive discretionary grants. So I'll open the floor if anyone has any initial thoughts with this discussion point.
Well, I'll say something. The original charts that you showed at the beginning, I think kind of answers the question, which is you actually, I think you can't really have a standard scoring rubric. A lot depends on the authority for giving us the money. Like the bank grant we got was based on provisions of consent decrees that had specific provisions. On the other hand, the partnership grants come with their own criteria. They have built-in criteria going on it. I'm a little concerned that having some generalized scoring rubric is inconsistent with that. Now, I don't think there's any problem saying that we should endeavor to consider some generalized factors, the factors that we consider in all grants, such as rural versus city, some of those factors. But I would hesitate to have it be any more than very broad guidelines saying that, consistent with whatever the underlying funding stream requirements are, we will generally like to think about the following things, but I wouldn't want to get too technical or too specific about it, because we in the first instance have to look at what the requirements are of the funding stream.
Crystal, I think Corey, Catherine, and then Jim had comments.
Sure, Corey?
Sure, thanks. In addition to what Judge Seligman pointed out, I think I'm not, I was on the commission before the numerical rubrics were introduced, when things were done more by a multi-factor test. And the use of numerical rubrics was introduced by bar staff. And I think the idea was that, I mean, I would assume to more uniformity and more transparency. But my impression since then is it hasn't necessarily made the decisions easier, but it does tend to kind of push for a specific number cutoff that can sometimes be kind of arbitrary, and that it gives that it does more to giving it the impression of objectivity than actual objectivity. That and it sometimes doesn't end up matching the actual applications you get, right? So you can decide in advance that, I mean, one example that I've seen in the past, which has probably been corrected for since, but you know, if you say, well, the history of the organization or the organizational infrastructure is X number, right? And that number makes sense for the vast majority of programs but then there's outliers where the organization is either incredibly effective or you have incredible concerns about the organization. And in those cases, that particular factor will have more weight, and maybe it should have more weight. And so having those does force you into whatever you decide in advance before you saw the applications. And of course that has some appeal too, right? It keeps you from changing your mind later on. But I don't know, from what I've seen, that the rubrics we've come up with have been so helpful to programs that it's added much beyond what listing the factors would be. So I'm just concerned that these numerical scores are giving, you know, a kind of mathiness that is maybe not warranted, and that there wasn't necessarily anything wrong by just listing the factors that were important and then weighing them accordingly.
Thank you. I think I have a couple of hands I see. Jim?
Yeah, well, for the sake of discussion, I'll take it the opposite point of view. My recollection of the numeric scoring was a result of the Appendix I review and the outside consultant. I think if Dwan remembers his name, I think it was Schaufler or something like that. But he in particular was highly critical of how we were distributing funds through the bank grant committee, felt that it was arbitrary, wasn't specified enough. And again, this guy, if I remember correctly, came from the Centers for State Courts, which is an agency that applies for a lot of federal and state grant money and is used to the federal approach from the Department of Justice, in particular the NIJ, where they follow like the National Health Institutes also, where they apply for grants. They have scoring committees of outside scholars who volunteer, and they quantize the various elements that they look at, and that provides feedback then to the grantees, especially those who are not funded, on where their grants were insufficient. I think you can have a standard rubric. I'm surprised you didn't put up, Crystal, the one that you had for our meeting.
Yeah,
because there are certain common things such as organizational capacity, such as evaluation, such as impact, and continuity and stability, although I would not support the particular numbers that we have here. But to answer the judge concern, a significant part, I would actually raise it to more of a third of the score, more like 30 points or 33 points for the specific grant considerations, so that you do address the concerns that the judge mentioned in terms of the source of the fundings and the requirement of what that particular source of funding requires for the grant to address. I think it can be done. Keep in mind, as I worked on the bank grant that had the scoring, as well as the homeless that had the scoring, what you find over time is that the more you deal with it, the more standardized it becomes. Keep in mind that it's not quantified insofar as the difference between 1 point and 2 points is necessarily the same as between 3 and 4 points. It's an ordinal scale. It's not a ratio scale. And I think people recognize that, but I do think it helps, at least it helped me in our discussions, being on the bank grant committee before we had the new rubric, and then after we had the rubric. It forces the people on the panel to be more particulate and elaborative on why they scored, say, on the issue of evaluation, why it got 15 points as opposed to 10 points, as opposed to 5 points, as opposed to 0 points for not being addressed at all. So I think it is helpful. I realize I'm more used to working with numbers than most of the people on the commission. And it takes a while to get used to, but I think in the long run, it does provide a level of more clarity. I don't know about objectivity, but at least clarity in terms of where grants are being considered strong and where where grant applications are being considered strong and where they're considered weak. And I think Dwan can answer this, but I think she mentioned our last meeting that we were getting positive feedback from the legislature in terms of using these rubrics, but I'll leave that to her to elaborate.
So in terms of ordering of whose hands raised, I only have limited.
Catherine next, and then Selena, and then Dawn.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. I haven't been involved in the discussion, so this has actually been very helpful. Thank you for the background in the proposed scoring rubric. It seems to me that one preliminary discussion is, what are we trying to achieve when we're using a scoring rubric? And I don't know whether the committee had a discussion of that, but I think it's worth a discussion to say, is it a mechanism? Are we trying to achieve a sense of fairness, for example, in grants administration? Are we trying to achieve a sense of transparency in how grants are administered? What goals are we trying to achieve by using a rubric? Because then I think that helps drive what does the rubric look like if there is a rubric. So I would just welcome the opportunity to do that. I'm interested in what the legislature thinks about a rubric. I'm interested in what is the Judicial Council, who provides some of the funding for this, think about kind of what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. And then I guess in terms of the elements that are reflected on this chart, I think it's correct that there's some threshold eligibility criteria. I think it's worth thinking about, are these the only ones? Are there other ones? And then I think the relative weight between the threshold requirements and the specific grant requirements, I guess I'm a little concerned that the specific grant considerations has only 25 points, a quarter of the points compared to the threshold eligibility criteria. That seems a little not like it should be, because kind of your capacity to do the specific things intended by the grant seems to me worth a bit of further weight. So that's my thinking.
Thank you, Catherine. Just to note, like, this was a very draft, like in terms of the point allocations, we just wanted something for the committee to respond to. So if this is a direction we seem to be in favor with, we can definitely adjust it. It was just a nice even 75-25 split, just quantitatively, so you didn't see any funky numbers, but I understand where you're coming from. Great. Do you have anything else to add, Catherine, or is it okay?
Sorry, did the committee have a discussion about what they were trying to achieve with using a scoring rubric, or did it just sort of start with, if we have a rubric, this is what it should look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I can speak on behalf of the Partnership Grants Committee, because that was one of the, I think, the newest one of the newer scoring rubrics that was adopted for the 2022 grant year. And the goals that you had actually mentioned in terms of transparency and equity in the review process were what we were trying to achieve with the scoring rubric, as well as, you know, being under the direction of the Board of Trustees to have a more transparent process. I will say, just based on anecdotal feedback from the applicants, it was really helpful for them to see, you know, which parts of the application were weighted more. And, you know, in addition, we updated the application to streamline with the rubric, just so it was an easy scoring and calibration and easy for the applicants to understand, just because, you know, previously there wasn't as much visibility or knowledge as to, you know, why they were getting funded, the amounts they were getting, or like what they were needed to improve on for the next year. So we were hoping that the rubric would at least start to address those types of things.
Thank you.
Selena, going down the line.
May have put her hand down.
Oh,
Selena, do you still want to make a comment? Maybe we can move on to Dawn.
Is it Dawn? Dawn, okay, great.
I was just going to share, yeah. So the last like 2 years, we've been getting a lot of questions related to the homelessness prevention funding. When the legislature has decided to consider, you know, providing more funding, and they've had a lot of questions around our selection process. So I've sent up kind of the staff memo as well as the scoring rubric and walked them through, you know, in some instances with some of the representatives, the actual scoring rubric, and explained how everything has happened. And everybody seems very, very pleased with the process, the transparency. And I think that they appreciate kind of the packet of materials that you all get when you go to make a decision. And I know that on the grantee side, they look for that if they're applying to get feedback. And then we schedule a call with grantees afterwards to walk them through why they received a certain point on that. So I can't speak in terms of like, you know, if generally programs are pleased with it, but anecdotally that has been what we've heard from applicants, that they appreciate the scoring rubric. If it's a helpful kind of point of reference, because a lot of this is anecdotal, if you wanted us to send out a survey to see kind of grantees' impressions, if that would help as you formulate an option. I know there's a little bit of survey fatigue in our community because of the rules codification process, but if that is something helpful, we can strategize on how to best get you that information, because this is kind of anecdotal, and I don't know if you want to rely on the few programs that have reached out to us and express positive feedback. But we have not received negative feedback, or I haven't personally, on having a rubric.
Crystal, there's a member of the public named William that has his hand raised. I'm gonna allow him to talk.
Sure.
William? Hello?
Good day, everybody. This is William Bushelli. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to respond briefly to Catherine's remarks on what is the goal that we are trying to achieve when using the rubric. And as a part of the partnership grants committee in that process, it still feels like there's a little bit of confusion for me on what that goal exactly is, whether it's trying to measure a program's impact or effectiveness or efficiency, or if it's more focused on measuring how good their application is. Some parts of it feel like it's measuring the application. So I haven't been privy to any past conversation on exactly what that is, or if I have, my poor memory has failed me here. But I do think an explicit recognition of what is going to be our definition of success, if the rubric is working well, would be helpful for me as a reference going forward, and I think for many other members of the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. So we have Donna and then Selena.
Hey, go ahead, Donna.
So this is an interesting conversation. because I also, like Corey, was on the commission for some time. I was actually on the partnership grant committee itself for 12 years before there was a rubric. And there was a sort of theoretical scoring guide, and there were a number of questions that all the people who were reading the grants were told you can but don't have to rate the answer to this question with a 1 to 5, but at no point, even if you did that, were those ratings discussed. It really I think there was very little transparency and accountability, and it felt very there just did not feel like there was a lot of guidance as to how you were supposed to review an application, how you were supposed to rate it. And I think it lent itself to certainly a risk of inconsistency in evaluating the program applications. I think Will's question is an important one. I think it exists regardless of whether there's a rubric, because there's always going to be a proposal that you are reviewing. And I think the key is, and I think the rubrics try and do this, and it's entirely possible that the rubrics themselves need to be, rethought. Maybe they didn't achieve all of the goals that they were trying to, and they can be revised. But I think there's absolutely a way to make sure that you are assessing the proposed project and not simply assessing the quality of the grant application itself. As I said, that's a risk. That same risk could theoretically exist regardless of if there's a rubric, because you're still rating an application, a proposal that comes in from a program. But there were important goals of accountability and transparency, giving the programs information as to what we are looking for, the commission is looking for in looking at these proposals, what they need to be talking to and or not talking to in their proposals. And so I think they are incredibly valuable and are something that that the commission should consider with the discretionary grants. Otherwise, I think there's a real risk of going back to a situation where there is there at least does not feel like that there is consistency or certainty in what is being assessed, and that leads to a lack of confidence in the grant decisions that are made.
Thank you, Donna. Was it Selena who was next, Elizabeth?
Yeah, Selena, then Amin, then Jim.
Great.
And
Thank you.
sorry, y'all, my internet has been popping in and out, so I may have to hold off my video every once in a while. I just want to +1 a lot of what Donna just said, and that's what I was going to say too, is that I think one of the real values of the scoring rubric is it communicates to programs what the commission is looking for. And so if a program puts together an application and they don't include enough information about evaluation, sustainability, and their organizational capacity, they know that they've really lost an opportunity to tell that part of the grant story. But I do think, along with what Catherine was saying about the importance of the specific grant considerations, I think that we as a community would not want to say that like a 70 beats a 69, a 71 beats a 70, because there may be pieces of that are so important. If an organization puts together a strong application on the first criteria, but their application doesn't address the specific grant considerations, that should be part of the grant committee, whether it's partnership grants or HP grant committee, about whether or not it's an appropriate grant application for that funding stream. Because I think what has been happening in the past is that they're kind of batched with like the high scores, the middle scores, the low scores, and they're kind of treated in batches, not that it's just pure numbers get you there. Because if you can't show project impact and you lose 15 points on that, that makes it a much weaker application than if you'd lost a couple points here and there. So I think that it's really helpful to communicate to programs that this scoring rubric tells them what to talk about in their grant application, but also hopefully it's helpful to staff and that you kind of batch the applications you spend more time on in the committee meetings. If they're a big batch of like low grant application scores, you would spend more time talking about the high and mid ones, and then maybe follow up with those programs later to say how they could improve their grant applications. So I'm in support of some scoring rubric, but just recognizing that pure numbers is not the most important thing.
Great, thank you, Selena. Is it Amin? Good.
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, I would also, we had a flavor of this discussion during our working group meeting, and to Judge Seligman's point, that was one of my initial concerns about having a standardized scoring rubric. Of course, you can't standardize the scoring rubric itself, but even the approach, I think, as I'm thinking this through a little bit more, given that each of these committees is addressing a different type of grant and a different set of goals for what the money is supposed to be used for, I do think that there is, my thought is that maybe there's a way to sort of meld these two things together, because I do think, having served on the bank grant committee and the HP committee, HP grant committee, there are different goals, different sort of uses for the funding, different priorities, but there is some overlap in terms of these threshold issues. And at a minimum, maybe sort of divorcing for now the point values, but having sort of consistency and definition for and how we approach each of these threshold issues, I think would be incredibly valuable as a committee and commission member. I think it would probably be, to Selena's point, and I think to what Donna was saying, having that will also give some consistency and transparency and kind of guidance for the programs that are applying that, and to the extent that those are consistent across the different discretionary grants, that then they don't have to recreate the wheel or reevaluate what these issues are for each of the applications. So these are sort of consistent themes for all of our discretionary grant making or funding. But so what I would propose or sort of throw out there is the idea that maybe this is kind of a template that each of the committees can use. We have a scoring rubric with certain threshold criteria that are consistent, that we've decided are consistent across, or should be consistent across all the discretionary grants, with consistency of definitions and how those things are described. What does project impact mean, for example, or what are we looking at in terms of administration and organizational capacity? But then, and this would be sort of like an initial, like, one-time thing for each committee to then go through and say, okay, what are the specific grant considerations and how do we want to apportion the point value so that we make sure that when we're doing our review, we're allocating these things with the appropriate priorities in mind. So that's sort of something to consider.
Thanks, Amin. Jim?
Yeah, a couple points. One point on Donna. Even though I support the scoring rubrics and I think they're worthwhile, of course, again, I come from a profession that uses it. On the issue of the reputation of the program, there have been studies both on the issue of awarding grants, double-blind studies, as well as publishing under peer review, that if the scorers know who's the author and knows the reputation, and it's like an outstanding scholar in the field, they tend to get scored higher, even when you have a double-blind situation where you're having the same grant or the same paper scored. When they know that the reputation of the scholar is high, they tend to score it higher. If the reputation of the scholar is unknown or they're new to the field, they tend to get scored lower. So no matter what you do, you can't completely control for that. Notwithstanding that, the field still use peer review for publications and they use peer review for grant review. To expand on Selena, I think one of the things that I think is important in this, and I think one of the things that we did in the bank grant that was helpful, is not only give the exact scores, but also just a generalized ranking. Was this a high, very valued grant proposal that should be funded regardless of its number, versus a medium versus a low? Because that's very helpful going back and rereading them. I found my own experience as a professor, if you read an excellent paper by a student and the next paper that you read is a good one, it's not going to look near as good because you just read an excellent one. As opposed, if you read a flunking paper, an F paper, and then you read a good one next one, the next paper, it looks like an outstanding paper and you tend to grade it higher. So it's really good to be able to lump these groups and to say like the very low or the unqualified, the maybe or medium qualified, and then the excellence. So it gives more value on your scoring. And it also makes you think, or made me think anyway on the bank grants, that if I rated something as high, but my particular scores in the different areas were not as high, then why did I think it was high? It forced me to articulate why I was evaluating this grant as high, even though my numbers didn't reflect it. And the same thing with something that's in the medium range or the poor range. So I think it's valuable. And I think as the commission, the more they work with it, the more the value they'll get out of it. And I also think too, that's one of the things that's helpful in NIJ is that the staff, the longer they work with this, then the more knowledgeable they are, and they can develop a sense of norms that is helpful in educating the commission. I think what we're having difficulty here is this is all new, both for the commissioners as well as for the staff. But I think after you have several years of iteration going through this, that there'll be a lot more standardization of values and it'll become a lot easier. And again, I think it provides valuable feedback to the programs.
Seligman?
Yeah, hi. I appreciate the comments everyone has made. And I have a slightly modified suggestion from what I said before. I don't have any problem with listing the generalized kinds of criteria that on your chart here and saying something to the effect of unless prohibited or limited by the funder, the source of our funding, the commission will look at the following factors. I'm still somewhat reluctant to put in the abstract specific points for each of them because it may depend on the project that you're looking at. It may make a difference. One thing, what we could do is here are the general criteria you want to look at and direct the commission in examining any particular new funding source to consider specific weights to be given to these matters, because it may depend on what it is. Some money may show up, which will be all for rural, and it will have, and that would be the main focus of the program. 15 points ain't going to be enough. It might be 50 points. It really depends on what the project is, or it could be like a very specific thing, like the grants we have. I forget what you're calling them for funding individuals waiting for bar exams. That's a very specific thing where the weighting process is much different, or could be arguably much different. So my suggestion is perhaps we have the general list. These are criteria we generally want to look at. And when we look at a specific project, the committee or the commission, whoever's looking at it, can develop a scoring rubric that's appropriate based on these factors.
Does Dwan? Oh, sorry. Dwan?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the groupings for me personally, once you have the scores and you talk about them in the kind of the high category and the medium, the low has been especially helpful. There seems to be a lot of consensus around the really strong applicants and the ones that don't score as high. And a lot of, I think the discussion at the committee level is at the middle section to see which ones, because we usually don't have enough funding to fund all of them, to pull in the medium to elevate it to high to be able to fund. So I think that's a helpful tool. What I found with the HP, and I think we learned a lot from the HP scoring rubric, because that's one of our first rubrics, is that it does take a couple iterations for us to fine tune things. And so I would encourage you all to think about not just the rubrics that we've gone through, but where we can get to. And we're on, I think, for at least HP, if we do another scoring rubric this time around, will be the third iteration. And I think from the last committee meeting for HP, we already brainstormed and have ways to kind of fine tune things. So I think though some of the rubrics that we've had in the past might not be perfect, we're improving on them, so that should be taken into consideration.
Great. And Corey?
Thanks. In terms of what Judge Seligman said, and taking into consideration the goals of the pot of money, which I guess is, in terms of what William had said earlier, is one of an additional goal of having a rubric was presumably transparency, fairness, but then also effectuating whether it's statutory intent or the intent of a settlement. I just wanted to say that I like these general categories that are on this sort of model, and I think it's a helpful model. But I think in some circumstances, the specific grant considerations wouldn't necessarily be separate from those other criteria. And so I would just want to make sure that if we had some kind of model like this, that it didn't necessarily force that into a separate box all the time. I mean, you can certainly imagine a grant that's intended for a specific underserved community, for instance, and or what the project impact is going to be connected to what the goal of the funds are. So sometimes I think it will make sense to do it this way and have this kind of overall, this goal as a separate metric. And sometimes I think it's gonna affect some of these other categories, and just keeping that in mind if we do have some kind of model.
Great. Elizabeth, are there any other hands raised?
I don't see any other hand raised. William did put a comment. To be clear, I wanted to emphasize the importance of setting the metrics for self-evaluation of effectiveness of our rubrics, the clarity on what's a great rubric do. But I don't see any other hands raised or requests in the comments.
Okay, great. I'm going to just back up on the discussion question just to make sure we've gotten preliminary thoughts on all of these. So I think we've kind of talked about bullet points 1 and 2. So the third one is just regarding the committee's focus on the proposals for these competitive discretionary grants. They're, in comparing with the IOLTA EAF review, LSC, and the foundation example, we just wanted to kind of revisit the committee's role. I think currently the committee reviews a subset of the applications, and that's reviewed. All the applications are reviewed in their entirety by staff. I didn't know if the Rules Committee wanted to give any input or thoughts, because I think there were, during the working group call, there was some discussion that maybe some categories would be better for maybe staff to determine, or have some initial recommendations just because of familiarity with a specific applicant. Yeah.
I can elaborate on that point just for a moment, just given our discussion at the working group, Crystal. And having been on the HP, in the HP process, I found, and I think others, I know others felt the same way, that in particular, here it's called administration and organizational capacity. I think it might have been called something slightly different during the HP process, but that category specifically, I think, was very hard for us to evaluate based on the applications. That's very much an organization specific and sort of reputational, or at least kind of, the staff having the experience of working with these groups, with the QLSPs on a regular basis, knowing the work that they do more, day in and day out than the commission or committee members, was incredibly helpful. And I think we relied heavily on staff recommendations on that particular item. And I think, sort of as a general matter, and we talked about this a bit, that to the extent that the commission or the committees are not, that every committee member is not reviewing every single application, having, staff a little bit closer to these organizations, a little bit closer to the applications, giving the context for some of these applications. In other words, if we get to Jim's point, right, if we get an application that is sort of a mediocre one in our preliminary view, But then, staff sort of tells us, well, in the grand scheme, it actually ends up being, sort of a low application because there are this many that are better, or these other projects that are being proposed, et cetera, that having that context can help sort of standardize a little bit more the review process. And so, in my personal view is I think, having the staff be involved, at least to the extent that they have been involved, is useful, and providing some of the feedback with respect to some of these criteria is incredibly useful as well. So I don't know that I would advocate for sort of taking the committee entirely out of that discussion, but certainly having staff recommendations for point values, to the extent that we have them, for example, on organizational capacity, I think is close to necessary.
I just go back to that slide again. Elizabeth or Dwan, was there anything else specifically regarding this point we wanted to ask the Rules Committee about?
Oh, Elizabeth, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, with I don't know if this is a kind of a one size fits all in terms of like the process for each discretionary grant. Like I haven't been on partnership grants myself. I have seen it be very valuable that there are certain commissioners, with a court-based experience that really lends itself to, reviewing the grant application and participating in the process. With some of the other funds that need to be moved pretty quickly, like the homelessness prevention grants that we're going to be administering for the upcoming year, there's a very kind of short timeline to review. I'm very curious about your thoughts on with that type of grant when it needs to be administered pretty quickly, whether you would feel comfortable having a model like the PLL where the staff takes more of a lead position in reviewing the grants and then bringing it to the committee for a recommendation and then ultimately to the commission.
So Dwan, it's Catherine. In that scenario, so we're really talking about this in the scenario of using a rubric. So does the staff then in that scenario that you just described, I guess with the PLL grants, does the staff then administer the rubric and make the scoring then available to the review committee, who does sort of a second quicker look at it? How I guess I'm just not understanding the connection between that review and the use of a rubric.
Sure, like in the PLL example, the rubric, the committee decided on the rubric and what to attribute points, and then the staff executed the scoring of it. So in that particular circumstance with PLL, there were 3 staff members that reviewed the full set of PLL grants and then came with a slate of recommendation to the committee. And then the committee then asked us questions about, why did you score this a certain way? What's the justification for this, about the process? And then approves the recommendation instead of doing alongside staff, which has been done with both bank grants, HP, and partnership, where what happens is the committee splits out into subgroups, usually 2 committee members and 1 staff. And the committee members review a slate of perhaps 10 applications out of a whole set of 40. The staff, we all review the whole slate. We've always reviewed the whole slate. That hasn't changed. But what that would change is instead of the committee reviewing a subset, the staff would continue to review the whole set and provide a recommendation.
But then does the committee look at all of the applications? So I'm just trying to understand the efficiency of that. So there's a difference to me between the committee only looks at the scoring but doesn't look at the underlying document versus I'm just trying to, having not been through this at all. Sure. So apologies for the kind of basic questions.
No, of course, this is helpful. The committee in the scenario where it's more staff led, all the materials are provided, but I don't believe that they're reviewing it at the level that they would be if they were divided into a subgroup where they're responsible for reviewing their set of 10 pretty in depth.
Okay, thank you. And I guess my other question on kind of the intersection between staff and committee reviewing is whether there are, I think it kind of goes to Means question. Are there certain categories that as a preliminary matter, it would make sense for staff to review? And then kind of the final decision is made. Are there categories within this organizational capacity that staff should do some ranking of candidates based on their review? And maybe only those that are in the, you know, the top half end up going forward for the committee because the staff is determined the organization doesn't have the capacity to administer grants based on concerns the staff had about the last IOLTA review, for example, that found, you know, problems with the whatever the reason was. So I guess I would get I would at least give some thought to, is there a I'll just call it screening, but it's more intense than screening, of just preliminary consideration of certain ones of the criteria that staff does and forward some subset of the total number to the committee.
That's what happened in that specific category, Catherine, organizational capacity, because we can run a report and let you know, if they've submitted something late, or we can give you kind of a general in terms of, governance or compliance issues. So for that category, it does seem like there's consensus that staff is in the best position to rate that.
And I would just add, Catherine, that with the partnership grants, were threshold eligibility requirements that staff pre-screened before the committee reviewed the applications. And that included that you're required to be a QLSP. You needed to have a partnership with the court, and there were several other criteria that staff pre-screened so that all the applications that the committee was reviewing were all already, at least met some threshold eligibility requirements.
So that makes sense to me. And I guess the question is, how could that approach be extended more broadly? Like I was fascinated by the specific grant criteria. I think it was for the bank grants, required that there be a diversity of projects. And it was a little hard to figure out like how you couldn't, it seemed harder to put a point number to that, because that's something that sits above it's an overall question, right? So when we get to the end and we're selecting grantees, do they meet the diversity, or are they all doing the same thing? And so is there a way at the front end you could identify the kind of the broad type of diversity you need to have at the end, and then there can be some preliminary ranking of proposals based in those different categories, knowing that you need to get to that diverse place at the end or something. I just found that to be a hard criteria to put into a rubric, because I don't know how to, at least a numeric rubric, because I don't know how to attach points to that.
I wanted just to mention something in terms of the partnership grant. So, what we've tried to implement was utilizing the scoring rubric as a tool for making any funding recommendations or decisions. So during one of the meetings, we had the scores for all of the applications, and then following that, and some tentative funding recommendations. Following that, the committee then asked to see different subsections, such as the geographic areas or substantive areas served, to get an even larger picture in terms of where the monies were going. So that allowed them to make additional decisions on top of seeing the scores as additional points of consideration. That's also a possibility possible approach that the committees could take if they choose to do so. Kind of coming from the end versus trying to preemptively figure that out at the beginning. So
yeah, I think that's actually helpful. So a piece of the transparency is to say, for this particular grant, we want we want the funded proposals to be geographically diverse, or we want proposals that are going to serve these specific targeted populations. And so that that's a piece of transparency to me, sort of knowing going in that we're looking for these things. And then when the grants are received, you're almost doing them in kind of buckets of, how many are geographically diverse, who's serving rural, who's not serving rural, who's serving immigrant communities, those kinds of things. So because the way that you're going to end up in the right place, if you've said you want that diversity at the end, is to be looking at those kind of in comparison to each other, or that is a factor, I guess. An overlay, I suppose.
Great.
I have a question, sorry. When we do have had more staff-led processes, which I think definitely makes sense in some circumstances, especially when we've had grants that need to get out the door really fast because the time to spend them down is short. What's the mechanism at the end if the committee disagrees with a particular recommendation? Because I mean, I think most of the time in most committees, people are going to agree with the staff's recommendation. But if there is some disagreement, like would a program need to be rescored? Or like, is there, how would that functionally happen? Because there's some circumstances where that would be pretty simple, like maybe if it's a question of where the threshold is and no one disagrees about the scores and it's just, do you cut it off here or there, then that's just a vote that can be taken. But if it gets into a question of funding one program versus another, then how would that work? Because I think it's fine to have staff-led program decisions with the committee making the initial rubric to begin with, since the initial rubric is essentially the policy determination. You know, when that's appropriate, depending on what the grant is. But I think then we still need to be able to show that if there's some disagreement, that there's a way of changing it at the end.
Yeah.
May I? You know, with the PLL grants, I don't think there was necessarily disagreement, but definitely that the committee wanted to know how we approach certain criteria, how we apply the scoring rubric, wanted to know our justification for why did you score this program very low, or why did you score this program very high. I imagine if there was actual a true disagreement, that perhaps the entire committee would then pull that application and review it, and we would have a more lengthy conversation. The other thing, another thought was that we do occasionally get applicants that are dissatisfied and would like to appeal these, that maybe perhaps it would be a good idea to have this, you know, the committee and the commission be that appeals kind of body for applicants that disagree with the scoring. And you know, with the staff-led, it's not staff decided. It obviously would come to the committee as a recommendation, and then go to the commission. And Elizabeth did remind me that, you know, on our application that there is no appeals for discretionary grants, but there have been instances, even though they have no appeals, we have met with the grantees to the applicant to explain through why they didn't receive a score. But if you wanted to move towards having some type of appeals process, because there is none now, that this could be a mechanism.
And I don't necessarily know whether it's like there. I mean, that's a different question. Mm-hmm. It's more just that that if as you say, if the decision making is going to continue to rest with the committee, that even if we know intellectually that 99% of the time that they'll probably ask a lot of questions, but yeah, you know, you all know what you're doing, and you mostly give good suggestions, that there just be like a determination of how, like, that there is some mechanism. So if it's you know, that some thought of like what that would look like, so that if that option is in place at the time of the meeting, right? So it's if it's, you know, no, we think you scored X incorrectly, do you need to take a vote on a new score? Do you need to go send it to someone else, or can you just does the body just have is it okay to just say, all right, well, we decide that we think this one is a better proposal and you're going to vote this one instead of that one? Or do you need to go through the scoring process again and have an actual number? Because just to make sure that it can be done cleanly, should it happen, so that actually remains a viable option, even if it's not exercised.
And I think the other thing that we've been skirting around a little bit, but I guess I'll just say it kind of bluntly, is I guess the staff's concern about splitting up the application amongst commissioners is that you don't get the advantage of reviewing the full set and comparing them one against each other. And there are some groups that may score more generously and some that may score more harshly. And so you might not be able to get that benefit across. And so staff having reviewed all of it gives it that consistency. I mean, we'd love for the commissioners to be able to review the whole set with us, but we've heard that that's just not viable for you to review all 70 applications the way we do, because this is our day job. And so that I think that's the tension. I just want to just put that really out there. And that's why the recommendation, at least from the staff view, is it might create not just an efficiency issue, but might help with the consistency in the scoring.
So how does staff ensure consistency among the different staff of the scoring then? Because we're all unique people. I might be a hard grader and you might be easier. So I guess that seems worthy of a discussion to understand how staff is consistent. But if the commission has an ongoing role in doing it, then what is the training or some sort of way of ensuring better consistency if that's been a problem?
And we have many calibration. Oh, sorry, I cut you off, Elizabeth. You go ahead.
No.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just going to answer Catherine's question for consistency. Staff, when we review a single application in the set, and we meet to calibrate to make sure that we are applying the rubric consistently and using the same factors. And then we also go through that same exercise with the committee with the same application, so that we try to have a consistent score for a single application. And it's a quite time intensive, lengthy process, but that's how we are trying to ensure consistency. Doing it for one application is, I think, very useful. However, as Dawn was saying, I think, when staff reviews an entire set, for example, with the homelessness prevention grants last fall, we all reviewed the entire set, and then we all met and calibrated the entire set together so that we could be sure that the staff score was using consistent factors.
So I'm sorry, is the conclusion from that then that it's not possible to calibrate the commission then? Is that the take?
It was very hard. Maybe I'll let some commissioners speak to that. Jim and Amin were on kind of, I can't remember if you guys were on the same group that, or different groups, but there were some groups that it was very hard to calibrate against when we have the benefit as staff, because we know that there's like a set. Some groups scored very low, but staff has the benefit of knowing, because we just reviewed the entire set, that maybe that scoring shouldn't have been as harsh. But it was very difficult to then calibrate that
Right.
group, because they had only reviewed that set.
Yeah, and one example I can give from my working group is in our set, we had one application from LA County, but we had, 5 or 6 applications from LA County in the entire portfolio of applications. So looking at that one application in LA, that application looked really good, but comparing it to other applications in LA, it didn't seem as strong. So I think that's the difficulty, as an example.
Jim?
Yeah, I think one way in which you could standardize the scoring, or at least have an understanding of how to weight things for the commissioners, is if the before you break it up into subcommittees, so say the bank grant committee meets as a whole, and the staff gives that committee 3 grants, one very good, one run of the mill, and one very poor, so that everybody could read the same 3 grants and see how to score and how they compare scores. And then you could divvy up the rest of the grants amongst those committee members, so that they're only doing, say, like 10 grants a group. That way you have at least a chance to meet as a group in order to standardize, or at least have an understanding how the staff is standardized, how they were scoring on the different criteria. We did a little bit of that, I think, for the homeless, or for bank grants, one of the other, I can't remember which one, but we met as a group to talk about the rubric and applied it all to the same grant, so that we had a feel for how to apply the different categories. And I think that can give you standardization.
I thought Bonnie asked an interesting question in the chat that I'd be interested in an answer to, because I was a little confused by the LA example myself. So that's what Bonnie's question goes to.
Sure. So Bonnie's question is, was there, does that mean that there was a geographical component to the rubric that you only wanted to fund a limited number of Los Angeles projects? Was that explicit in the application? So there's not a geographical component in the rubric, and it wasn't explicit in the application, but I think when we are making recommendations, we've often provided to the committee and to the commission maps of where projects are, and you know, what the spread is across the state, so that the commission gets a sense of the projects that could be funded across the state. And so I think perhaps I didn't give a great example, but I don't think we had in mind that there would only be a certain number of projects funded in a geographic area.
But I actually think if that's important, right? If it's important to have geographic diversity and there's an intention to want to ensure an increased number of services available, therefore grants available in rural communities, I actually think that's a piece of being transparent and saying, essentially, our intention is to provide grants across California, and that might mean that a grant from, I'll say Butte County, that isn't as strong as a grant from LA County, but you know, still a proposal that's at least in the middle, right? It can do the job, might get funded over something that's in LA County, and that should be a thoughtful at the front end kind of discussion and statement so that people have some understanding. If there's 10 really good proposals from LA, they may not all be funded, and it might only be the top 3 or the top 5 because it's really important to provide the resources in other parts of the state.
I think that's a great point.
Personally, I think that's okay.
Yeah, and I guess I think it's important to be explicit about that. The other thing is, for example, with Shriver, I think that the programs, you know, could anticipate that there would be a limited number of programs funded in each county. So they banded together with a number of organizations that came in under one proposal. And I feel like it would be good if we were explicit about how we were going to handle that. And I agree. I think geographic diversity is, you know, great value, and we certainly make attempts to serve in rural areas. I think it's just, if we're going to have a rubric and we're going to score on things, I think we should be transparent about what we're scoring on.
And so that might be the first part of some of this work, is to then sort of think through the overarching criteria that guide the rubric, so that can be explicit at the front end. And we've talked about kind of the easy ones, which is, you know, kind of like transparency, for example, and so forth. But if it is targeting, ensuring kind of broad geographic reach, that may be an important thing to have as an overlay. And I'm not off the top of my head going to think of all of them, but I think it's worthy of us thinking through.
Jim?
Yeah, at least in the bank grants and in the homeless prevention, both of those had a geographic element, in that the bank grants set a preference would be given for rural programs. And so that was specifically scored. In the homeless prevention, it was more ambiguous and difficult to apply because it said rural areas or other underserved communities. And then what is the definition of underserved communities? Because in one aspect, almost everybody that's being funded in these programs is an underserved community, and that we're talking about the poor. So I think that one was a little bit more difficult to apply, but in both of those, rural projects were given a preference. They did have an element to score, and so the LA projects would be scored less on the issue of rural if they weren't focused on, say, the Antelope Valley area of LA County, as opposed to the rest of the county. So there was an element, and that can be scored.
All right, Duan?
I was just going to say, Judge Selman also agreed in the comments, geographic diversity. And, you know, the HP grant, because it was one of our first scoring rubrics, like I said, you know, we had a lot, we learned a lot from it. And the geographic diversity was one of the things that we learned, that the committee wanted to then provide a geographic diversity, but because we weren't explicit in the rubric, I don't know if you all recall, Bonnie, at that meeting that we didn't end up reshifting because we didn't have a mechanism, because it wasn't transparent. And so because of that, we learned that. And then in the PL grants, what we did was, with Brady's assistance, we came up with some language, not just for geographic diversity, but there were some other factors that were important that we provided, you know, for complete transparency to applicants, that, you know, these scores aren't, I can't remember the language right now, aren't in and of themselves kind of decisive of funding decisions. Other factors may be taken into consideration, such as geographic diversity, because then it sends a signal that it's not just the scores alone. And I think this might go to Corey and Judge Selman's kind of initial points at the beginning of discussion, that there probably is a level of discretion that you want to retain, and it's not all about the scores. So perhaps building in those other factors and being transparent in the RFP, that there are these other factors that might not get built in just the scores, that will lend itself to an ultimate decision.
Can I follow up on that point for a second, which is, can we do that, right? Can we say, you know, we're taking the approach of having a scoring rubric approach, right? We're using that as a guide, but make clear that this is not necessarily, it's not a pure, if you get an X number of points, you automatically get funding, or if you get X number of points more than another project, another proposal, then you do get funding versus not. Because I think the discretion is important. And I think just kind of acknowledging that there is, no matter what, going to be an inherent imperfection in this process, right? You're still comparing, you know, 70 applications. You're still, you know, each of these items is not, you know, purely quantitative. It's very much a qualitative analysis. That at a minimum, this can be kind of a guiding approach for us, but give ourselves that latitude that, you know, we can make a funding decision that is not purely based on numbers. I guess it kind of gets to the idea of, is there going to be an appeal process available? What does that look like, et cetera? But I think it makes sense.
And maybe Brady can speak to that, because he did help us with at least the PLL grants, write in those other factors as kind of, you know, then you know, an applicant can't point to, well, it wasn't explicitly in the rubric, but we had language that said that we were going to consider other factors. So I think having worked with Brady on that it is possible. But Brady, are you on? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there we wanted to maintain the flexibility, and I think it's just important that in whatever we put out there, we're clear, because we knew that we were going to be able to want to consider those factors, but they weren't necessarily in the rubric. So we didn't want to make a representation that the rubric was the be all and end all. So the flexibility was built in from the front. I mean, ultimately, all these grants, you know, they give us discretion. So we have that discretion, but then if we're publicly saying how we're going to use this rubric, that, you know, by nature limits our discretion. So we tried to strike a balance there.
Great. So this was just the final slide in terms of process. Today was just really a preliminary discussion, getting everyone's input and thoughts. Thank you very much. So in terms of the next steps, staff will convene with the working group, kind of talk about the feedback that we heard from this meeting, and potentially develop some preliminary recommendations to be shared with LAC. And I believe we have an in-depth discussion scheduled for August 24th, or not in-depth discussion, sorry. This would be the review of the working groups and the community feedback for the committee's review and consideration on August 24.
Would it be possible to share the draft with the committee just at the same time that it goes to LAC, just so we're sort of aware of how things are progressing?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, that's all I had on this presentation. Let me exit screens.
It's really interesting. Thank you so much, Crystal.
And if anybody else has any thoughts, and even if you're not in the working group, we welcome them as you think of anything else. Great. I mean, that's all the staff has.
Yes, Selena, did you raise your hand?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, my only comment is that I actually think it's entirely likely that the Trust Fund Commission will receive more funds that will be discretionary grants. And I think setting these kind of like clear expectations on the front end of what would be included in a rubric helps you as you move forward if, you know, more money is dropped in your lap by the legislature, perhaps. And so I think that not only should we be thinking through these current ones, but really like what are we building out for the future? And what can programs expect? So I appreciate the opportunity to brainstorm, and I am happy to get more input from programs because I think if they're applying for more and more discretionary grants from you, I think they will appreciate some level of, you know, not well, sameness or whatever, predictability in the discretionary grants.
Great.
All right. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion. I do think this is one of the sort of I mean, there's so many issues that we're addressing in the Rules Committee, but this, I think, is one, to Selena's point, that's going to be sort of very much an impactful decision that we'll be making that will address what we as a commission are doing, you know, the core of what we're doing. And I think there is a lot of experience that folks who have been on the committee and in the working group are bringing to the table that is really helpful. I think the perspectives that we shared today are really great. And I'm hopeful that we can get to a place where we have this level of sort of transparency and clarity and guidance going forward. And so thank you everybody for the input, and thank you to the staff for putting this all together and guiding us in this way. So I think with that, unless there's anybody else that has a comment or would like to say anything on this issue, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone. See you all next month.
Later this month.
Sorry, later this month, and then
later this month.
Bye now.
Bye, everybody.